morning and welcome back to the lecture series on tribal studies, interdisciplinary perspectives and approaches. So, today we are going to discuss the tribal uprising during the colonial rule in central and southern parts of India. The British colonial rule introduced policies in India that had very negative or detrimental effects on the indigenous people, reflecting a colonial ambition to bring populations that were deemed as primitive and residing in the forested areas under a centralized bureaucratic control. So, we see that the British policy led to the official classification of the tribal groups, and among these classifications, most notable one is the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act, which imposed restrictions on the movement of tribes which were identified as having a history of criminal activity, thereby unjustly targeting the entire community for maybe some acts committed by a handful of population. So, such criminal act, the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act criminalized the entire community, the entire tribe, regardless of individual behavior, thereby causing a widespread stigmatization about this entire group. So, due to their profound ignorance about the Indian social structures, daily life and economic and social systems, the East India Company's early attempts at imposing orders and implementing rules mainly with the intention of improving taxation have had very negative, very detrimental effects or consequences. Their errors compounded the difficulties that the weaker sections, the tribal communities were already facing in terms of economic and social setback. So, instead of facilitating or uplifting or in a way supporting the tribal communities, the British policies would further imperil or jeopardize their situations. The 1878 Indian Forest Act established the British state as the forest conservator and thereby effectively denying the Adivasis their age-old unrestricted access to extensive forest lands, and this restriction remained in place, remained intact until the end of the colonial era. The colonial rule triggered widespread indigenous resistance with revolts that occurred routinely, especially in the 19th century. Throughout the 19th century, we see that different tribes were revolting against the British Raj, either passively and peacefully, or they were actively taking up arms and weapons and resorting to a battle, a war cry against the administration for very unfairly, unjustly taking away their lands, their natural habitat and forest resources. Notable examples of such sporadic rebellions occurring throughout the 19th century include the Santhal, the Naikda, Koli and Mundari rebellions. These insurgencies represent only a fraction of the total conflicts, as Ranajit Guha documents that over 110 peasant uprisings happened during this era, during this entire century. British forest control transferred significant power to the moneylenders, traders and immigrants who were non-tribal in terms of their ethnicity, thereby causing a further widespread Adivasi land displacement. This phenomenon of Adivasi land displacement became rampant, became widespread and very conspicuous during this century, thereby enraging the tribal population. Scholar and critic Nandini Sundar contends that the economic and environmental impacts of forest contracting, commercial exploitation of forest resources and the restrictions on shifting cultivation, grazing and foraging, particularly severe during the drought, were all summing up, they were all crucial factors which triggered the 1910 Bhumkal rebellion among the Gonds from the Bastar state. So, the colonial rule marked the first time in Indian history when a government claimed a direct proprietary right over the forests. In this regard, critic Ajay Varghese notes that the tribal conflict in Bastar region during colonialism rose directly from increased British influence, with three policies particularly inciting the native population. One would be the British control over forests, next displacement of tribal communities, and thirdly the interference in the royal succession. So, we see that the way life happened and life would go on in the pre-colonial times was greatly disrupted with the intervention of the British colonizers. So, talking about the Bhumkal rebellion of 1910, we notice that according to critic and scholar K. Singh, the Bastar rebellions that continued between 1876 and 1966 involved the primitive tribes, and they would center the chief, the tribal chief, his projected visit outside of his state in the year 1876, the uncertainty about his succession in 1911, and further his denigration and manipulation in the 1960s. There were supposedly as many as 7 rebellions during this period between 1876 and 1966. But this was only an ostensible cause. So, this whole Bastar rebellions, this series of rebellions happening during this time was not only triggered as a result of the chief. At the root of such provocations, such insurgencies lay the forest question, the semi-feudal exactions or exploitations locally known as begar, the maladministration and further the exploitation of the tribal people. So, all we need to understand here is that in the pre-colonial times, the relation between the tribal and the non-tribal might not have been very smooth, and this perception of being different from one another had always been there. However, it was only during the colonial rule that monopoly over forest property, over forest resources was announced by the British Raj, and this happened at the expense of dispossessing and displacing the tribal populace from the forest areas who have had an ancestrally speaking organic connection with these lands, and they were not destroying the forests because they lived off the forest. They were very mindfully and very almost it is innate among the tribals to use forest resources, but also to preserve forest areas because they have a spiritual connection with the flora and the fauna there. So, such exploitative relationship with forest lands had never been there. This came with colonial intervention, and this was understood as unprecedented. Even the mainstream non-tribal native societies vice or negative qualities that were percolating into the tribal societies, this entire process of percolation of usury or moneylenders influence in the tribal areas was catalyzed in the presence of the colonizers. So, talking about the Bhumkal rebellion in the year 1910, we see that in February 1910, the tribal inhabitants of the princely state of Bastar in eastern India rebelled against the small British force that was stationed there. This event, locally known as Bhumkal or earthquake. So, Bhumkal, the word Bhumkal means earthquake in English, and it marked Bastar as a crucial battleground for the Adivasi resistance during the colonial period. Next, we are going to talk about the Rampa rebellion of 1922. So, Rampa rebellion is synonymous with the name of Alluri Sitaram Raju, who was a young Kshatriya from West Godavari district. Raju had quit traditional studies at the age of 18, seeking the life of a hermit, and he would spend time meditating and praying in the forest. So, Sitaram Raju adopted a hermit's life, settling in a tribal village which brought him into direct interaction with the tribal communities. British administrators demanded unpaid labor from the tribals for the cause of forest road construction, and this was a task that the tribals were ill suited for. They were not trained in such activities. And on the other hand, we see that the non-tribal laborers were reluctant to work in malaria ridden areas. These forest areas were mosquito infested, and people were prone to acquiring diseases like malaria. So, non-tribals would usually not want to work in these places, and so the tribal people, much against their will, were being forced to work as road construction laborers. We see that petty British officers compelled the Koya and Konda people, people belonging from the Koya and Konda tribal groups, to provide forced labor for road construction, resorting to coercion. The exploitative demands of these road builders triggered outbreaks of unrest in the tribal areas. Determined to end the merciless exploitation of the tribal regions by the outsiders, mainly the British colonizers, Alluri Sitaram Raju decided to lead a tribal rebellion against the British, integrating their struggle into the broader fight for independence. For 2 whole years, Raju employed guerrilla warfare tactics, successfully defeating the local police in numerous engagements and seizing the police stations. The British responded by imposing a complete blockade on the agency tracts, deploying police and troops to encircle the area, to incarcerate the area and cut off all supply routes from there. According to Case Singh's study, the British officers responded with intensified raids on tribal hamlets, thereby resulting in the abuse of women and destruction of crops. Alluri Sitaram Raju, deeply affected by the plight of the tribals, chose to surrender to the police at Koyuru. The British executed him by shooting and buried his body in a place called Krishna Devi Pit. And then entire police troops would proceed to capture and kill nearly all of his followers by the end of September 1924. So, by this time we see the entire Rampa rebellion crushing or collapsing to an end. It went on for nearly 2 years and very successfully, but with the assassination of Raju, this entire rebellion collapsed. So, next, talking about the uprisings from central India, we need to discuss the Gond revolt in the year 1940. So, Komaram Bhim was a leader with considerable influence among the Gond people, and he led the Gond revolt of 1940, which took place in the Babijari village within the Aifabad taluk of Adilabad district. So, this revolt was instigated by the forced eviction of Gond and Kolam settlements from the Dhanora state forest, and people as a result were enraged. So, we see that the Gonds that were otherwise facing relentless exploitation by the non-aboriginal landlords, and there was a general official apathy towards their maltreatment, their mistreatment, were rising against the authorities for the first time. So, we see that they found a leader in Bhim who could unite hundreds of tribesmen for collective action against both the landlords as well as the British officials. K. Singh informs that within the Gond cultural context, where the Bhatkals or seers were known for their trance-like experience, their spiritual experiences and divine positions, Bhim's claims of supernatural powers would further boost and bolster his leadership. So, Bhim, just like Birsa Munda, would be perceived as a demigod figure, a person who was born within the tribe to take the tribe forward, to save the tribe from all kinds of trials and tribulations. So, he was perceived as a savior of the Gonds. So, Bhim was perceived as having the ability to hear and follow divine orders, divine commands. Here, Bhangya Bhukia notes that Bhim adopted arms or weapons only when he is pleased to get permission for cultivating land was refused or dismissed. Even before taking up arms, Bhim even wrote a letter to the divisional forest officer or DFO, but it did not work. The communication just failed. So, instead of solving the problem amicably, we see that the divisional forest officer sent a force to crush the Gonds. He sent several armed forest guards to enforce evacuation of the tribals from the forest areas. So, we see that Bhim's establishment of Gond Raj included a structured governance system and a tribal army which was funded by the village contributions. The rebuilding of Jodhghat symbolized this new order. So, under the auspices of Bhim's leadership, we see a decentralized local governance system being laid out, which would not be in agreement with the British Raj. It would be an autonomous body that was economically being fed through collective village contributions. It was outside of the jurisdiction or the juridical system of the British Raj. So, talking about the village of Jodhghat in the context of Gond revolt, we see that the village of Jodhghat was burned down by the armed forest guards, and then it was later reconstructed at the same site by the villagers. It goes on to show the sharp protest and resistance by the grassroots people against the authorities and their determination to settle down in the very same place that was burned down by the forest guards. So, tensions escalated when the Gonds assaulted a sub-inspector, which led to increased tribal support for their leader Bhim. However, the Adilabad Talukdar, with a significant police and official contingent, responded to this attack and assassination of the sub-inspector by marching to Jodhghat. Bhim's attempts at rallying his followers were met with gunfire, which resulted in heavy casualties and a swift suppression of the Gond resistance. So, following the killing of the sub-inspector, Talukdar and his contingent swiftly crushed the power, the force of the local Gond tribal army or tribal warriors. So, to conclude, the tribal uprisings in central and southern India during the colonial rule as exemplified by the Bhumkal rebellion by Gundadhur, Gond revolt of 1940 led by Komaram Bhim, and the Rampa rebellion of 1922 led by Alluri Sitaram Raju, all of these protests and rebellions highlight a consistent pattern of resistance and protest against the unfair British policies centering forest land and forest resources. These movements, while varying in scale and methods, together shared some common grievances. These grievances were encroachment upon traditional land rights, the imposition of exploitative labor practices, and the disruption of established social and economic structures that the tribals were enjoying for many generations before the British came to this land. So, with this we stop our lecture here today. Let us meet with another round of discussions in our next lecture. Thank you.